Coming to you from a cozy little condo high atop Old Fourth Ward, Atlanta. Welcome to The Ron Show on America One Radio. Here's your host, Ron Roberts.
Well, good morning. We awaken today to a bit of a reset. Obviously, we know now as we awaken that President Joe Biden has decided to step aside in the 2024 presidential campaign, continuing to serve his term until January, and his successor has been sworn in. In a letter yesterday released first on the Twitter X platform and then circulated throughout media and other social media platforms as well, he writes, "My fellow Americans, over the past 3.5 years, we have made great progress as a nation. Today, America has the strongest economy in the world. We've made historic investments in rebuilding our nation and lowering prescription drug costs for seniors and in expanding affordable health care to a record number of Americans. We've provided critically needed care to 1 million veterans exposed to toxic substances, passed the first gun safety law in 30 years, appointed the first African-American woman to the Supreme Court, and passed the most significant climate legislation in the history of the world. America has never been better positioned to lead than we are today." His letter yesterday continues, "I know none of this could have been done without you, the American people. Together, we overcame a once-in-a-century pandemic and the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. We've protected and preserved our democracy," he writes, "and we've revitalized and strengthened our alliances around the world. It has been the greatest honor of my life to serve you as your president, and while it has been my intention to seek re-election, I believe it is in the best interest of my party and the country for me to stand down and to focus solely on fulfilling my duties as president for the remainder of my term. I will speak to the nation later this week in more detail about my decision." Let me step aside and point out that he has been battling COVID for 4 or 5 days now. I'm sure his voice is raspy. You hear from folks who have spoken to him over the phone about that. He's waiting to regain his vocal strength so that he can address the American public in a meaningful way. The letter concludes, "For now, let me express my deepest gratitude to all those who have worked so hard to see me reelected. I want to thank Vice President Kamala Harris for being an extraordinary partner in all this work. And let me express my heartfelt appreciation for the American people for their faith and trust you have placed in me. I believe today what I always have, that there is nothing America can't do. When we do it together, we just have to remember we are the United States of America." Joe Biden signing that and sending it out yesterday to announce that he will not be seeking re-election in 2024. He followed up with an endorsement of Vice President Kamala Harris to succeed him, and figuring out how that happens is currently in process now as we speak. Joining me first to discuss the gravity of where we are this morning as we awaken to that news and to what we see as momentum, first with the nudge by the current president of the United States towards his vice president to succeed him as the nominee of the Democratic Party, is Melita Easters. She is executive director of the Georgia Win List and a longtime journalist. You were there the night Jimmy Carter won the election in 1976 in Plains, Georgia, on the ground in his hometown. A momentous occasion for Georgians, but let's talk about the historic moment that we're living in today. You have to go back to LBJ deciding not to run again for different reasons, but that's how far we have to go back to even resonate with where we are on the news that Joe Biden, the current president of the United States, has opted not to seek a second term. Your initial thoughts to all of that?
Well, certainly it is a historic time, but the times are so dramatically different with a 24/7 news cycle, with the idea that no longer do we have to sit down and actually physically turn on a television, change channels. We carry the news around in our hands, in personal devices, with us at all times. So the times have changed, the news medium has changed, and In this historic moment, women know far better what is at stake for them because the former President Trump, who seeks re-election, has bragged about the rights he has turned back the clock on for women. And we know that that would be a primary focus of his second term because of the vice president nominee he chose, J.D. Vance, who runs to the right, if that's even possible, of Donald Trump, and who has not only opposes exceptions for rape and incest for abortion, he has praised women who stay in abusive marriages. He walks with those who would even ban contraception in many forms. So women do not want to walk back the clock. Women are far more confident. Back in 1968, women couldn't even have credit cards in their own names.
Mm-hmm.
So women have come a long way, baby, to paraphrase an old cigarette commercial, I think.
Yep.
And women are not going to be willing to walk back. And now with the opportunity to have another woman presidential nominee, women who maybe weren't as motivated to work for Hillary Clinton now see the consequences of a second Trump term, and they are going to hit the streets. And we saw that last night, even in the record-setting for one day fundraising on behalf of the now Kamala Harris campaign.
We're speaking with Melita Easters, who I should point out, Executive Director of the Georgia Win List. That is an organization that identifies and backs female candidates who are running for pro-choice legislation. And so that's an important point that you point out, that when we were rallying to vote in 2016, most of us who listening this side of the aisle anyway for Hillary Clinton, we had sort of taken for granted that Roe was the law of the land and that was safely in tow. And again, awakened to the news that Donald Trump had been elected president that fateful day in 2016. And so women, you would think, are going to be more motivated perhaps than they were in 2016, not taking for granted what obviously doesn't exist anymore. You speak to candidates and women in office throughout the state of Georgia already. What is the vibe? What is the energy level? Can you put it on a scale of 1 to 10?
Oh, I think the energy level is edging on up towards 10. I mean, women don't want to go back, and women are motivated, especially Black women who are the backbone of the Democratic Party. Women are motivated to truly hit the streets and campaign.
Yeah, the AKAs we know are going to be in tow. There's like 250,000 door knockers ready to hit the streets and do so for their sorority sister, no doubt about it. But beyond that, obviously we saw, as you mentioned, record-setting fundraising. What was it, $49.5 million? I'm sure it's probably beyond that at this point in time. But I mean, the swell of cash that came in just from the endorsement from President Joe Biden nodding towards his Vice President Kamala Harris really opened the purse strings.
Well, and then the other thing is, this will, in Georgia at least, have an impact. We have what we call the rising blue tide lifts all boats. We believe at WinList that when we have women on the ballot enthusiastically campaigning, even in ruby red areas, they move the needle of Democratic performance and help candidates. The down ballot candidates can boost turnout for up ballot candidates who can't personally knock doors. So we have 77 WinList endorsed women for November. 50 of them are in contested races. So they're going to be knocking doors, and they're going to be knocking doors in 81 of Georgia's 159 counties. Yes, we have 20 women who are running for seats that are in Fulton County, and 13 women in DeKalb County, and 9 in Gwinnett. But the rest of those women are scattered all across the state, some of them in places where no Democrat has been on the ballot for a legislative seat in more than a decade. So those women are champions of all the Democratic values, and they will boost enthusiasm for this top of the ticket. And there will be plenty of enthusiasm for the top of the ticket. In 2018, when we opened our training classes for women who were thinking about running for office, we had an unprecedented number of women apply for that training. And we had to have 2 classes, not just one, because there were so many women interested. And we've had record-setting numbers of women on the ballot ever since.
Can you speak to the impact that just having Kamala Harris, we presume will be the presumptive nominee, although there's still a lot of details to be worked out on the Democratic Party side. But speak to the thought of Kamala becoming the Democratic nominee. Do you think it would have a similar impact on women deciding, you know what, I can run for office too?
Oh, absolutely. I think it will have an impact on women running for office. You know, this election cycle, 2022, is the first time women in Georgia qualified for office after Roe was overturned. Yes, the decision was handed down in 2022, but it was handed down after women had qualified for office. So these ripple effects take time to manifest. And so in campaigning for Kamala Harris will give, provided that she crosses the hurdle and becomes the nominee, as it appears she will, campaigning for her with a whole new, younger generation of women will inspire them in 4 to 6 or 10 years to run for office, because we're still seeing the impact of those women who campaigned for Hillary Clinton in 2016, getting affairs in order, allowing their children to get a little bit older. All of those women are now running for office and giving us the record-setting 77 we have on the ballot in 2024. So it can only go uphill from there. And Georgia is one we rank 22nd in the nation for the percentage of women in the General Assembly. And even though we're a state controlled by a Republican trifecta, our Democratic women outnumber Republican women 3-1. So the more women we elect to office, the better able they are to promote the policies which help women and children.
More with Melita Easters from the Georgia Win List when The Ron Show returns on America One Radio. Follow The Ron Show on your preferred social media platform. A treasure trove here of late at Ron Show ATL on the Twitter X platform, Instagram, Threads, Facebook. We're with Melita Easters, Executive Director of the Georgia Win List. Thank you for joining me this morning. I appreciate you rallying with the notes and the information on such short notice. The news breaking yesterday afternoon, President Joe Biden will not be seeking re-election. And he then followed up with a social media post endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris to be the presidential nominee for the Democratic Party. The party's still having to work that out, but there is a lot of folks already lining up behind her and a lot of small donors already lining up behind her as well. So it seems that the groundswell is fully in motion. She went immediately into action to start rallying those troops. So she's already in campaign mode. I want to talk to you a little bit about what we can expect to come from the right. I don't want to start looking at the darkness in the clouds, but let's speak a little bit about the conversations that mothers and fathers, I would think, are going to have with their daughters about the sort of vitriol to expect in the next 106 days.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, and it's always a pleasure to talk with you. Well, the first thing I would say is, yes, the right and the Republican Party will come after Kamala with everything they've got, just as they came after Fani Willis when she brought charges against the former president. There's always been a hope that a Black woman prosecutor could bring down Donald Trump and keep him from a second term. And now the focus shifts from Fani Willis and the prosecutor in New York to the former prosecutor, the former attorney general, the current vice president, Kamala Harris. So, of course, there will be things said about her that maybe I don't know what they'll say. I don't want to give any airtime to what the negativity might be. But for even the Republicans, they need to be very careful about what they say against Kamala Harris because their daughters are watching. You cannot criticize Kamala without having the listening ears of young girls hear what you are saying and project that on their own future dreams and hopes. So I would caution the Republicans in what they say about Kamala Harris, because quite frankly, they have embraced a very misogynistic attitude in the Republican Party, not just with the convicted and twice impeached former president, who's a felon now, a convicted felon. They have endorsed for their vice presidential candidate a relatively inexperienced senator who has a very misogynistic record with public statements. Does the Republican Party fully embrace this misogyny? Because if it does, remember that your daughters are watching.
I almost feel like there's going to be the female version of the talk to young people who, again, can expect a litany of misogynistic statements and vitriol against, again, who we presume will be the nominee of the Democratic Party. Who do you, in your esteemed opinion, think would be the proper running mate for Kamala Harris? Do you have a short list in your head?
Well, I think the short list has been fleshed out in the media. You don't have two women on the ticket when you're trying to elect the first woman to begin with. You probably don't have two people of color on the ticket. And you probably don't, a lot of people love Pete Buttigieg, but you don't try to elect a woman of color and a gay man at the same time.
Yeah.
So that leaves us with the two of the most likely suspects for nomination to the presidency as North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper and Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear. Now, Andy Beshear is younger, but he has not served as governor quite so long as Cooper. Cooper's been governor since 2017, which means he is nearing the end of his second term as governor, and he is term limited. He's had a very successful record of working across the aisle. He would balance out the southern part of the ticket with the California residency of Kamala Harris. So I would think that those two are the most likely. The other thing is that Cooper represents a state with 16 electoral votes,
right,
and he has won statewide twice. Kentucky, by contrast, has only 8 votes.
Yeah.
And then the other candidate that has been mentioned is possibly Mark Kelly. He's a genuine American hero with his military service, has his work as an astronaut, and now his Senate service from Arizona. But Arizona has only 11 electoral votes. And then the other thing is we all admire and appreciate his wife, Gabby Giffords.
Absolutely.
The former congresswoman. Is she up to the task of campaigning as the potential vice presidential spouse after the injuries she has suffered? Dare we even ask that of them as a couple when they have given so much to this country already?
I'm sure these conversations are being had behind the scenes and then, of course, out in public, perhaps even in the Democratic National Convention as that comes forward in the near future. We see that we should have at least one more presidential debate. There'll be a vice presidential debate, the Democratic Party convention. To me, in my mind, those are 3 televised events that can only boost Democrats' poll numbers for prospects on this November election. Do you agree with that assessment?
Oh, absolutely. But you're already hearing that Trump probably will not agree to share a stage with Kamala Harris. And the thing is, now that President Biden has removed himself from that part of the analysis of the presidential campaign, Trump is the old one.
Mm-hmm.
Trump is the rambling one.
Mm-hmm.
Trump is the person who can't possibly tell the truth, who doesn't even know what the truth is. So all of a sudden, Trump becomes the focus. His age, his mental health, his ability to stick to the facts, his ability to respond quickly to questions without meandering off into other topics. So all of a sudden, almost everything that the lens of public attention, the microscope or the magnifying glass that was focused on Biden over the last few weeks shifts to Trump. That scrutiny will not show him in a positive light if indeed the media holds him to the same standards President Biden has been held to.
Well, we'll wait and see about that. I've had my quibbles with the media, even those that aren't in the Fox News Newsmax bubble, doing their jobs and doing it credibly. But I appreciate your time. Melita Easters, Executive Director of the Georgia Windlass, joining us to discuss Joe Biden stepping down, Kamala Harris, the presumptive, we would assume, Democratic nominee, on The Ron Show this morning. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me on.
This is The Ron Show on America One Radio.
Joining me now to discuss the historic moment we're all living through right now, Sagamore Hill Consulting's Andrew Heaton. Andrew, where were you? Do you remember where you were when you heard the news?
Yeah, I was just, I was in my apartment and I was just sitting there and like everybody, it was a tweet notification. A tweet notification changed history for me.
Yeah. And I was out literally showing houses yesterday, and I started getting text messages. Did you see? Did you hear? I'm like, leave me alone. I've got to get these clients under contract. Anyway, so as soon as I got to the car, it just kind of blindsided me. It's funny how like we all sort of were waiting for this expected news to come. But President Biden had really dug in his heels over the last 3 weeks and gave us no indication whatsoever. No waffle. I saw no evidence of even waffling on his posture, on his position. And then all of a sudden, it just like that, it just went away. So you being a consultant and having worked through several campaigns, this is just such unique new territory. Is there any experience that you can glean from this that gives you any insight on how this can play out?
No, I mean, no. In many ways, we are in very new territory.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that is unprecedented in very recent history. The best that you can do to look at some kind of analogy would be '68 when LBJ dropped out midway through the primaries. But even then, like that was just still such a different era. You were just really, people had just started to embrace the idea of the primary system as we know it today. At that time, you still had some pretty heavy influence from party leaders at that time, and so it really is. I don't think we can look to anything as a clear analogy. As far as where we go from here, though I will say, I think one of the best gifts that he could have done for us as a party was the fact that he immediately and outright endorsed Vice President Harris, which what you've seen over the last 24 hours is a pretty strong coalescing around the vice president. You've seen it in money, you've seen it in endorsements. So while I know that, technically we're going to go into the convention probably with an open convention process, I think what you're going to see in reality play out is that by the time we get to the convention here in a couple of weeks, it's pretty clearly going to be the vice president who's going to be the nominee.
Yeah, the major names that would be bantied about for the most part have all I hate to use a Game of Thrones reference, sort of bent the knee a little bit. Gavin Newsom, Gretchen Whitmer are the two that come to mind. Now, Joe Manchin is soft pedaling his way back into the party. He'd like to rejoin the party. He'd like to re-enter the chat, and I don't know if the Zoom administrator is going to let him back in. But he's talking a little bit about trying to re-enter and create a little bit of a stir. Is there any appetite for that whatsoever, you think, in the big tent of the Democratic Party?
No. I mean, that's not to say there might be some outside pockets that might have some interest in that, but no, for the most part, the majority of the Democratic Party, their view on Senator Manchin is that he made his choice.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
His choice was to no longer ride with the party, to no longer ride with President Biden's administration when it was important. So I don't think there's going to be much of an appetite to ride with Manchin going forward.
Yeah. Thanks, but no thanks. Have you ever worked on a situation like this where you had a campaign that had a small window and had to, hit the ground running fast to kind of close a gap or to get the deal done? Have you ever had to work on a campaign in such a small cycle?
Not in this manner.
Yeah.
I feel, we saw something similar play out when I was working with Jericho Richardson's congressional campaign, but it was kind of the opposite way. We had a window where the judge had tossed out the old maps. So we thought that we were going to be in a brand new congressional race, and we thought it was going to be wide open. And so we had a small window where, now we're in a primary that we very possibly is going to be more favorable to us. Because originally, when Jericho first declared or first started really feeling out the field in 2023, her full intention was to run against a Republican.
Mm-hmm.
And so then when all of a sudden it seemed like, it might be, there was a thought that it was going to be, okay, we get this chance now. This is going to be a much more favorable district. But then once the Republicans passed their new maps, that immediately made it clear that Congresswoman McBath was going to shift. And she almost immediately said, yep, I'm coming to the 6th now.
Yeah.
You watched that small window almost slam shut immediately.
Yeah. And then you also have the scenario where it's not as if Vice President Kamala Harris is an unknown commodity, and she comes in with a rather heavy purse. And that's before the $50 million fundraised and counting, I would think, since yesterday afternoon. She should, I would believe, have access to all of the Biden-Harris, now Harris for President campaign money that was pretty much drying up over the last 3 weeks. I would imagine those spigots will reopen, but she comes in with a much more sizable purse as well, and of course the name recognition that goes with that. She didn't fare so well in the 2020 primary season, but I always tell people who bring that up, well, first of all, 2020 was such a unique animal. We really had to rally behind someone pretty quick because the pandemic was there.
And it's funny because I tell people this, I have a unique perspective or a different perspective on Vice President Harris, just because I lived in California at the time when she was Attorney General.
Okay.
And then ran for Senate the first time. And she, I think the 20 campaign, and I think, most people would agree there were definitely some missteps from her campaign in that 20 primary. But I think she as a candidate is much stronger than people give her credit for. And now there's kind of been this almost like, because of the way that race played out, I think people see her as a certain candidate. And what I've tried to tell people is, I promise you are underestimating. And I think people are going to be surprised that she actually is a much stronger candidate than either the 20 campaign gave them the impression or that they remember.
Mm-hmm.
I think also the way that the media will grasp onto specific clips and specific memes, it creates an image of a candidate. Vice President Harris is a much stronger candidate than people are giving her credit for, and I think you're going to see that. And I think just even in the last 24 hours, you've seen that play out. I mean, this is the machine around her that has really gone into hyperdrive. And the way that you've seen the party coalesce, and I think it is going to be. You are seeing an excitement in the Democratic base right now that you have not seen in months. Like there was an energy that I started to see, a groundswell of support and energy and excitement that we have not seen in a long time. So I think Vice President Harris is going to be able to ride that wave, and it's going to be very, very interesting and exciting to watch.
I liken this a little bit to a video game where you unlock some new tools when you're playing a game. I feel as if that moving on from President Biden to Vice President Harris as the presumptive nominee really unlocked some tools that the party wasn't going to have at its disposal if Joe Biden were going to remain atop the ticket. The youth enthusiasm, we were starting to hear noise, if not actually seeing it bear out yet, African-American voter support degradation. And I think Vice President Harris, again, unlocked some tools that we probably didn't have at our disposal before.
There was I don't know if you've seen about this. I was in a group chat with some of the folks who were on this call, and they kept telling us about the updates. There was a call last night with voters of color, particularly African-American women. It was a Zoom call. It was a national-wide strategy call. Started out with, it was meant to be around 100 or so folks. So many people joined it that they had to call in the CEO of Zoom to give them the authority to go above it. Ron, this call eventually reached, I believe it settled around 40,000 predominantly Black women jumping on a call that had originally had no agenda of being that large.
Wow.
And I mean, in a matter of like an hour or two. And and this call then lasted and lasted and lasted. It was I think at some point it went over 3 hours when it again had not been intended to go that long, because the momentum and the excitement kept growing. And then this is one of the things we talked about this, you and I, as an aside, a couple weeks ago, and I think the key demographic, which everyone knows, the key voting bloc for a Democratic coalition right now is African American women. Mm-hmm. And what I saw yesterday, at least in my community of Democratic supporters, Democratic activists, Democratic law, the folks who actually do a majority of the work in Democratic politics. What I saw from that community amongst Black women was just a wildfire erupt.
Yeah.
And I think it is. And that's one of the things why I say, when you see some people talking about, okay, well, no, yeah, sure, he endorsed Vice President Harris, but we can still have an open coalition or an open convention. I'm like, yeah, technically we could, but I'm telling you what I'm seeing. I don't think you put that fire out. I think it's pretty much a wrap.
Also, I would also caution anyone who wants to think about any other method of getting there. The 4 letters FAFO, F around and find out. I like you saw on my social media feeds just an immediate eruption of support and enthusiasm that, honestly, I knew in my heart of hearts. I mean, I've been depressed about this for months now that I just wasn't seeing. And I feel like, again, we've sort of awakened the ghost or stirred some echoes that will reverberate for the next 106 days. How do we look now at President Biden? Obviously, I think history is going to shine on him in ways that many, especially pundits on the right, don't see. But I think history is going to smile favorably on him, and I think this, to me, is like the icing on the cake for his lasting legacy. He obviously has not given an appearance since he's been dealing with COVID, but when he gives that speech, that address to the American public, what are your expectations?
I think he is immediately going to become, if not nationwide, at least in the Democratic Party, he is immediately going to cement his legacy as one of the beloved figures of the Democratic Party. And whereas now, because of the fear of a Trump win and the fear of what the race was going to be, you had, consternation, you had frustration, whatever, all of that swept aside now. And so now what you have is people get to just revel in the actual accomplishments and legacy of this first term, which has been a historically progressive, historically successful first term, in both in the amount and scope of legislation that his administration has passed. But then you combine all that with the idea that not only did he help turn out Trump from the White House in 2020, but then listened to the people, listened to the folks around him, and to again try to protect democracy, voluntarily step down after one term. I think that kind of selflessness, that kind of willingness to do what he thought was right for the nation, he will be remembered fondly for generations.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see how this televised moment plays out. I was speaking with Melita Easters from the Georgia Win List earlier. There's a second presidential debate if Donald Trump deigns to show up. There's the vice presidential debate and the Democratic Party convention. I had really forgotten about Biden's address to the country, I would presume later this week. To me, those are 4 televised moments that Democrats have an opportunity to boost poll numbers and their standing with the American public.
Well, you have a contrast. You have a contrast of the two sides. You have a former president who, to this day, even despite the attempt on his life, which everybody felt sympathy, felt relief that he had not been killed, all this goodwill, at the RNC, he gives a speech that immediately reminds everybody, well, right, I'm glad he's alive, but right, this is who he is. He's still someone who pretty much just thinks about himself, frames everything in how it relates to him. And there is a self-centeredness that immediately President Biden provided the contrast for. Like, this is who they are. This is who we are. And I think that you're right. You combine that with the moment of what could be just a historic address. You combine all those factors together. I think it gives the Democrats a real opportunity to just build through, get to the convention. You have this unity. You're seeing it around the country. You're seeing state party leaders. You're seeing, delegates. You're seeing entire congressional coalitions come together. It is just, I think it's going to be actually what he has sparked. Whereas Democrats in disarray was the articles for weeks, I think he has now single-handedly potentially sparked a moment of unity that we haven't seen in a long time.
And now we can say Democrats in array.
Yes. I as someone who is always trying to advocate for us to be in array, I'm very happy.
Andrew Heaton, Sagamore Hill Consulting, thank you for your time and your reflections today on The Ron Show. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, Ron.
As always, show notes available at ronshowatl.com. Not many show notes today, just because we've had full-fledged conversations. Again, my thanks to Melita Easters with the Georgia Win List for joining me early on to give her perspective and thoughts on what we will assume to be the handing over of the torch, the baton, if you will, from President Joe Biden to Kamala Harris, his vice president, to be the nominee of the Democratic Party with just 106 days before Election Day. Also, Sagamore Hill Consulting, Andrew Heaton joining us to have a full-fledged conversations as well, providing his insights. Republicans are already freaking out a little bit about this, and it's a tell. It's such a tell that they believe that they had this in the bag with Joe Biden on the ticket, and now that Kamala Harris will presumptively be the nominee. House Speaker Mike Johnson yesterday on the talk show circuit's already talking about the problems that they're going to erect on behalf, of course, of the 14 million Democratic Party voters. It's notable. It's laudable. It's almost sweet how they're all of a sudden concerned about liberal votes and them being counted. Unlike in Florida circa 2000 or in 2020 when Donald Trump was trying to erase what the will of the voters were in key swing states that he thought he had in the bag. All of a sudden now, House Speaker Mike Johnson and Republicans are concerned about liberal votes. Speaker Johnson with CNN's Jake Tapper on State of the Union yesterday.
Do you think that whoever emerges from the Democratic Convention as that party's nominee for president and vice president, do you think those people should be on the ballot in all 50 states? Or would you support efforts to sue to keep those nominees off state ballots, assuming it's not President Biden and Vice President Harris?
Look, I'm a former litigator, a constitutional law attorney. I've just made note in some comments over the last week that they have real problems. I mean, every state has their own election system. That's our constitutional system. That's the way it's done. And in some of these states, it's a real hurdle. They have a real problem of replacing the nominee at the top of the ticket. Remember, Jake, Joe Biden was chosen after a long, small d Democratic process by 14 million people emerging through that primary. It will be very interesting to see if the so-called party of democracy, the Democrats, go into a back room somewhere and switch it out and put someone else at the top of the ticket. I mean, I think they've got legal hurdles in some of these states, and it'll be litigated, I would expect, on the ground there, and they'll have to sort through that. They've got a real problem. You know, it was interesting. I listened to the Joe Manchin's interview, which was compelling at the opening of the show, and he made the point that this is not his father's Democrat Party. It's not the party he knew as a young man. He wanted them to be sensible and moderate, and they aren't anymore, and that's why he left the party. We're seeing that across the board. We have a demographic shift going on in the country right now with a record number of Hispanic and Latino voters and black voters, African American voters, the Jewish community coming into the Republican Party because they're looking for answers to all these great challenges facing the country, and they feel like the woke progressive left has taken the Democrat Party way over the edge. They have, and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris helped engineer that, and I think they're responsible for it.
Former Trump advisor Stephen Miller on Fox News.
They held a primary. People, they had ballots. They filled out circles. They went to the voting booths. They spent money on advertisements. And as President Trump said, the Republican Party spent tens of millions of dollars running against Joe Biden.
Aww.
Now they just woke up one morning and said, never mind, we're canceling the entire primary. We're getting rid of our candidate, and we're pretending the election has never even happened, and we're going to let donors handpick a new nominee.
Point of order, historical note, the GOP 2020 primary never happened. It was canceled as well. Any notion of someone running against the incumbent president in 2020 for the Republican Party was snuffed out immediately. Conservative pundit Scott Jennings with Caitlin Collins on CNN yesterday.
Well, obviously, President Biden made this decision, one that, some Democrats wanted him to make it sooner than now. But
is it interesting to you that we haven't seen a picture of Joe Biden today? We don't have a picture of him signing the letter. I mean, this is a huge decision. Also, the letter doesn't say why exactly he's stepping down. Why is he stepping down? He's the current. We've been talking about this for weeks. He's the current president. He's now apparently unable to continue in his race. We don't know why exactly he is stepping down. I think Republicans who are raising concerns about his fitness to lead today have good questions today, and now they're unanswered by this letter and the mystery surrounding him today.
Yeah, well, he does have COVID, so I think that's probably why we're not seeing him. I just talked to Chris Coons, his co-chair, who spoke to him after this announcement came out and talked about this. He said he's not resigning the presidency, despite those calls from people like House Speaker Mike Johnson.
Yeah, that's going to be the next pivot. And honestly, another dog catches car potential mistake for Republicans. They're going to clamor, make noise for Joe Biden to go ahead and step down now, which then means that they're going to be running against an incumbent president, Kamala Harris. America gets normalized to that reality in the next 100 or so days if he were to do that. I think be careful what you wish for in that regards. And when it comes to the 14 million votes that were already cast, keep in mind, those voters voted knowing that Kamala Harris was the, air quotes, backup plan, the vice president in tow with President Joe Biden. They were already voting for her as well. Besides, having her, if Kamala Harris does wind up being the Democratic Party nominee, having her on the ticket in November gives those 14 million Americans, and we would assume, 65, 70, maybe more million Americans, the opportunity to affirm that choice again, which I think concerns those on the right, including the felon, former president, twice impeached, Donald Trump. Again, CNN's Caitlin Collins.
He told me in a quote, and I'm quoting the former president now, he said, referencing Biden, "He is the worst president in the history of our country. He goes down as the single worst president by far in the history of our country." But what I pressed him on, Alex, and obviously what's important here is what this means for him and for his campaign. He told me that he believes that Vice President Harris will be easier to beat than Joe Biden would have been. Obviously, we don't know that she is going to be the nominee. Obviously, Biden has endorsed her, but there is a real question among Democrats over what that's going to look like. And also, I should note that Trump's team has been so worried about this exact situation. They wanted President Biden to stay in this race because they looked at the numbers that we were all looking at, that Democrats were all looking at, and they thought that essentially that he would fare better against President Biden in this race.
Exactly. Well, too bad. Someone once said something about a black job, and the office of the presidency could very well be one. We will replay today's show 5 to 6 p.m. on the America One Radio app, on demand all day at progressivevoices.com, and then via podcast. Back tomorrow, 9 to 10 a.m. on America One Radio. Have yourselves a great day. We'll see you.